Read it in court, and everything will change. If stories of truth, healing, and legacy speak to your heart, please subscribe and stay with us until the very last chapter of this journey. The Mid-Manhattan Library on Fifth Avenue was a sanctuary of whispers and dust. Afternoon light slanted through tall windows, landing in golden stripes across rows of mahogany tables. The air smelled faintly of aged paper and floor polish, the kind of scent that carried centuries of voices and secrets bound in cloth and leather. Ava Reynolds, only 11 years old, sat tucked into the farthest corner of the second floor. She had made the library her safe harbor these past few months. While other children crowded playgrounds, Ava had discovered that books never turned her away, never mocked the patched sleeves of her cardigan, never asked why her shoes were scuffed. They welcomed her, and so she came faithfully, her small backpack filled with pencils, a peanut butter sandwich, and the stubborn hope that each day she might find something that mattered. Her fingers trailed across the spines of a row of forgotten law journals, heavy tomes that hadn't been borrowed in decades. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She never was. But when she tugged on one faded green volume, it slid out stiffly, and something unexpected fluttered down. A thick envelope, sealed in crimson wax. It landed on the wooden floor with a muted slap, dust rising like a ghost. Ava froze. The wax bore an imprint, an old-fashioned notary seal, and on the front, in careful black script, 3 words. Affidavit. Confidential. Ava picked it up with both hands. The paper felt heavier than it looked, almost as though it carried weight beyond ink and parchment. She sat down, her heart thudding. The librarian's desk was empty, and the nearest patron was lost in a newspaper, unaware of the discovery she had made. She slipped a finger beneath the flap. The wax cracked softly. Inside was a document that looked too formal for chance. Cream-colored sheets, notarized signatures, dense lines of testimony. And clipped to the affidavit was something else, an email printout, the header showing addresses she recognized though she'd never seen them before. Sabrina Ellison, Whitfield Labs, confidential chain. Ava's lips parted. She didn't fully understand the technical jargon in the email, but she understood enough. Phrases like altered results, PR strategy, suppressing data. The affidavit included a sworn statement from a technician who claimed he had been ordered to falsify DNA test results, with Sabrina's name attached. A cold ripple went down Ava's back. She knew Sabrina's name. Everyone in New York did. Sabrina Ellison, the polished executive who had tried to tear down Mason Whitfield in court and in the press, framing him as reckless, corrupt, heartless. Ava had seen the headlines, watched the news segments where Sabrina smiled like a woman already victorious. Now, in her trembling hands, Ava held something different, something dangerous, something true. She stuffed the envelope back inside her backpack just as footsteps echoed on the marble floor. It was Mason himself, tall, impeccably dressed, his jaw tight with the exhaustion of too many battles. He had come to the library looking for silence, perhaps a few moments away from the scrutiny of cameras. But instead, he found Ava, this little girl who had once changed his life already, who seemed to stumble across truths the way others stumbled across pennies on sidewalks. "What is it?" Mason asked gently, crouching so his eyes met hers. Ava hesitated, then slowly pulled out the envelope. The wax seal dangled broken, evidence of discovery. She placed it in his hands as though handing over something alive. He flipped through the affidavit, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the signatures. He skimmed the email chain, each line cutting sharper than the last. His throat tightened. "This isn't just paper," he whispered. "It's proof." Ava leaned closer, her voice no more than a thread of sound. "You told me once that truth leaves a receipt. Maybe. Maybe this is it. For a long time, Mason said nothing. Around them, the library kept its quiet breathing, the turning of pages, the shuffle of shoes, the distant cough of an old man. But in Mason's chest, silence was replaced by a roaring certainty. He slid the affidavit back into the envelope and held it tight, knuckles white. If this was real, it could unravel everything Sabrina had built. It could expose not only her lies but the machinery of betrayal that had crushed his company, stained his reputation, and endangered countless children waiting for life-saving treatment. Mason looked at Ava, a strange mix of pride and awe stirring inside him. How did this girl keep finding the keys others were too blind to see? She wasn't just a child anymore. She was the witness fate kept sending again and again. "Come on," Mason said at last, his voice steady, almost solemn. "We're taking this where it belongs." Ava asked, "Where?" Mason's jaw set, eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. Court. By the time they left the library, the envelope sealed once more, Ava felt the cold November wind whip against her cheeks. But inside, she carried a warmth she hadn't known in years, the warmth of knowing that truth wasn't lost, that maybe, just maybe, the lies of the powerful could still be pierced by the hands of a little girl in a second-hand sweater. And Mason, clutching the affidavit, knew with sudden, fierce clarity that the battle wasn't over. It had only begun. Mason's office, high above Madison Avenue, had the hushed geometry of a battlefield paused between volleys. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the bruised gray of a late autumn sky. A single fern leaned toward the light as if listening. The desk, walnut, clean lines, no clutter, held only a laptop, a legal pad, a fountain pen, and the red-sealed envelope Ava had found at the library. The seal was whole again, repressed over the break with a careful palm. Beside it, a blue ribbon lay coiled like a promise. Ava stood on the visitor's chair, elbows on her knees, small and intent, the way children are when they understand the air is electric. Mason entered a long password and unlocked his machine. The dual monitors woke, an empty desktop, then a cascade of windows, email client, document viewer, a temporary folder he'd created a year ago and named, almost superstitiously, receipts. He scanned the affidavit one more time, letting its sworn density settle like ballast in his mind. Then he clicked open the attached printouts, cleaned scans he'd fed through the document feeder. Subject lines blinked like flares. Run set 11, revised crisis prep, comms deck, variance talking points. He enlarged the first thread. At the top were the names that had dogged the last year of his life. Sabrina Ellison, SVP, Strategy and Communications, and beneath her the lab technician who'd signed the affidavit, Gilbert Shu, MS, Clinical Genetics. Below, timestamps, CCs, blunt directives. He scrolled slowly, reading aloud for Ava's benefit, and perhaps for his own. Variance outside acceptable range. Apply corrected baseline per prior discussion before release. Do not forward raw electropherograms. Consolidate under revised template. Legal is aligned on phrasing. Use inconclusive as last resort, otherwise led with consistent with. Ava's eyebrows knit. What does that mean? Mason took a breath, measuring the words so a child and a jury could follow. It means someone told a scientist to change the numbers so they said what she wanted them to say, and she coached the press team on which words to use so the lie sounded technical. He clicked into the next attachment, a PDF of chromatograms and allele calls. Colored peaks marched across the screen, evidence that looked like art until you understood the language. He toggled to a note from Gilbert. For sample ID WHF047, original call shows mismatch at D8S1179. Applying your baseline shifts, concordance, 97%, flagging that this deviates from SOP 4.2. SOP? Ava asked. Standard operating procedure. He pointed to the footer. Every lab has rules that protect the truth. How you collect data, how you store it, how you read it. If you break those rules, what you say next isn't science. It's theater. He opened the company's communications deck. Slides with cheerful icons that had cost a boutique PR firm too much money. Bullet points choreographed calm. Reinforce reliability of third-party verification partners. Frame discrepancies as industry-typical artifacts. Humanize leadership. Emphasize commitment to patient safety. On another monitor, he pulled up an older email he'd archived months earlier from an external PR contractor. The line that had kept him awake then landed with a duller, heavier thud now. We can survive the science. What we cannot survive is doubt. Neutralize the technician. Our focus is the story. Ava shivered, though the room was warm. They talked about the story like it was more important than the truth. Mason nodded. Stories move markets. But so does the truth, if you can prove it. He returned to Gilbert's emails. The man had been meticulous even while obeying orders, leaving breadcrumbs in language that sounded bureaucratic, but read like conscience. On December 12th, 11:03 p.m. Per request, substituted corrected allelic ladder. Note: original ladder retained in personal archive. Chain of custody intact until 2142. Chain of custody? Ava echoed, marking the phrase like a stone she could keep. That's who touched the evidence. When and how, Mason said, and something like gratitude flickered across his face for a stranger who had documented his own unease. If the chain is broken, the defense can say the sample was tampered with. If it's intact, the truth survives the room. He clicked to the bottom of the thread. Earliest messages. There, stamped with a date 6 weeks before the press storm, was Sabrina's first instruction. We need harmonization with Whitfield's legacy messaging for Phase 2. Update baselines accordingly. Legal approves this is within interpretive discretion. Interpretive discretion, Mason repeated, tasting the cynicism. A fancy way to move a fence post and call the field the same. He searched the domain for more, filtering by Sabrina's address and the word variance. On the right monitor, a list populated, 38 emails over 3 months. He traced the chain outward. Sabrina to Gilbert, Sabrina to a media strategist, the strategist to an analyst who pre-wrote Q&A answers for journalists. He opened one doc titled Bridging Language. If pressed on discrepancy, pivot to replicability. Multiple independent runs confirm. Stress patient privacy to avoid releasing raw data. Use noise, artifact rather than error, manipulation. Ava's mouth tilted, equal parts child and judge. They built a maze. And hired tour guides, Mason said. He dragged each relevant email to receipts and mirrored the folder to a secure drive, then to a second one he kept in a locked drawer, the ritual of a man who had learned the price of trust. Finally, he opened a blank notepad and began sketching a simple map, the kind he would want a jury to see. Order, action, cover story. He wrote names and arrows, dates that would matter, verbs that would land. A soft knock. It was Carrie from Legal, carrying 2 coffees and the cautious smile of someone who had weathered too many storms at his side. You asked for espresso, she said, then saw the screen. Is that? It is, Mason said. He kept his voice flat, untriumphant. I want a litigation hold on Whitfield Labs' email servers, Sabrina's team, the contracted PR house, and the external verification vendor. Preserve everything from 90 days before the first variance note to the week after the press conference. Full scope. Carrie's pen was out before he finished. On it. You'll get affidavits of preservation by end of day. Ava watched, absorbing terms that would have been foreign yesterday, already building a quiet lexicon for courage. Chain of custody, SOP, variance, hold. She glanced at the red envelope and then at the monitors where sentences glowed like exit signs. Will they say it's nothing? They'll say it's complicated, Carrie answered, dry as old law books. Complicated is how people hide things they don't want regular hearts to understand. Then we make it simple, Mason said. We show the jury the before and after. We show them where the fence post moved. Carrie nodded, already dialing at T. I'll loop in the forensics team. Also, press is sniffing. If you want to stay ahead, we need a statement that says everything and nothing. Not yet. He glanced at Ava. No theater until we've secured the stage. When the door closed, the office felt taller. Sirens far below braided into the city's constant hum. Mason turned back to the screen and opened the last email in the earliest chain. A message Sabrina had sent to herself from her personal account, then forwarded to corporate to clean the threads. She had forgotten to scrub the first hop. It read, Draft for tomorrow's talking points. Goal, maintain confidence. Frame deviation as methodological reconciliation in service of patients. Risk, technician non-compliance. Secure NDA, incentive. Incentive? Ava asked softly. Money, Mason said. Or a promotion, or silence disguised as kindness. He exhaled. The new path assembled itself. Grand jury subpoenas, depositions, the civil trial already calendared, and beyond it, the work that mattered more than the courtroom. The fund. Children waiting. Hearts tiny and fierce. He pictured a stage under warm lights in the conservatory garden and a blue ribbon knotted around a microphone. He pictured proof that didn't live on paper. He closed the laptop and looked at Ava. We'll take this to the U.S. attorney. The grand jury will want to see the chain. And when the civil trial starts, we'll lay it down page by page. No rush, no rage, just light. Ava's eyes were steady, older than 11 in that moment. And if they try to talk louder? We'll speak clearer. He rose and crossed to the window, the city vast and ordinary, 1,000 lives unfolding oblivious to the fight in this room. He pressed his palm to the glass, more vow than gesture. Behind him, Ava slipped off the chair and came to stand beside him, their reflections a mismatched pair grafted by purpose. She glanced at the envelope again, the crimson seal, the coiled blue ribbon, the symbols they hadn't chosen but now carried. Mason? He turned. She said it like a password they shared, a line that felt both courtroom and cradle. Truth with receipts. He smiled, something like weather clearing across his face, and completed it in a voice that reached past the walls and into what they were building. Love with receipts. Then, as if he'd been saving it for precisely this hinge, he crouched to her height and spoke the sentence that would become their compass, the one a jury would later hear and the city would repeat because it was plain enough to live in. Truth always leaves a receipt. Ava nodded, small chin lifting. The map on the notepad glowed with arrows and timelines. Outside, a patch of sky broke open, a thin seam of pale light. It wasn't victory, but it was direction. They turned from the window and got to work. The federal courthouse on Pearl Street rose against the November sky like an austere fortress, its limestone walls holding the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Security lines snaked across the lobby, the air thick with the metallic hum of detectors and the clipped shoes of attorneys rushing toward fate. Mason Whitfield stood among them, not as a defendant this time, but as a witness summoned to present the documents that had begun to burn like coals in his chest. Ava clutched his hand, her fingers small but unyielding. She had begged to come, not out of childish curiosity, but with the stubborn conviction that truth didn't belong behind closed doors without witnesses who cared. And Mason, though wary, had allowed it. She was no longer merely a child in his life. She was part of the chain of custody itself. The assistant U.S. attorney, a woman named Linda Carver, met them in a windowless waiting room outside the grand jury chamber. She was brisk but not unkind, her dark suit marked by the faint smell of burned coffee and long hours. She extended her hand to Mason, then knelt briefly to Ava's level, acknowledging her presence in a way few adults bothered to. "You understand, this proceeding is sealed," Linda said gently. "What's said in that room doesn't leave it. But it may decide what the world sees later." Ava nodded solemnly. "Truth leaves a receipt," she whispered. Linda blinked, then glanced at Mason. He only shrugged lightly. "She's been studying," he said. Moments later, Mason stepped into the grand jury chamber. The room was stark. Wood panels, an American flag, a long horseshoe table where 23 ordinary citizens sat in silence, waiting to hear whether charges should be brought. The court reporter adjusted her machine, fingers poised. Linda called the first witness, Gilbert Shue. The man entered hesitantly, his lab coat traded for an ill-fitting suit, the air of someone who had lived too long in the fluorescent glare of basements. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and took his seat. Mason watched him with the quiet reverence one feels towards someone who finally chooses to stand upright after years of bending. "Mr. Shue," Linda began, "do you recognize these documents?" She held up the affidavit, its red seal now photocopied into the record. Gilbert's fingers trembled as he took it. "Yes," he said, voice low. "That's my signature. My statement. Can you explain in your own words what you were asked to do?" Gilbert swallowed, eyes darting toward the jurors as though he feared their judgment more than any gavel. "I was instructed by Ms. Sabrina Ellison, among others, to alter baseline readings in DNA testing, to make inconsistent samples appear consistent. It violated standard operating procedure." "Why did you comply?" His shoulders hunched. "Because I was threatened with termination, and then offered a bonus if I cooperated. I justified it as interpretive discretion. But it wasn't. It was fraud." The room was silent except for the scratching of the stenographer's keys. "Did you inform anyone at the time?" Linda pressed. "I kept original data in a personal archive, dated, time-stamped. I hoped it might matter someday." Mason felt something in his chest unclench. Here was the receipt, spoken aloud. Then Linda asked the question that shifted the air. "Mr. Shue, do you have knowledge of payments or inducements made in exchange for your cooperation?" Gilbert hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Sabrina authorized wire transfers. Not just to me, to others, including media consultants who were paid to frame the narrative." The jurors leaned in as if one body. "And are you willing to testify to this under oath in open court?" Gilbert's voice broke, but the word came clear. "Yes." Linda gave a small nod. "No further questions." When Gilbert left the room, Mason glimpsed his face, ashen but lighter, like a man who had finally exhaled after years underwater. The next witness was a financial officer from Sabrina's team, a man in a tailored suit whose arrogance cracked the moment he realized the plea deal required truth, not theater. He spoke of slush accounts, coded invoices, dinners disguised as patient outreach. He detailed how Sabrina had maneuvered a narrative strong enough to sway investors and crush Mason's credibility. "She said," the man recalled, "we don't need facts, we need headlines." The words clanged in the chamber like a bell struck too hard. By the time Linda called Mason forward, the jurors already wore the look of people who had glimpsed the machinery of deception. Mason raised his hand, took the oath, and sat tall. He laid the affidavit on the table, the emails projected on a screen behind him. He explained, not with flourish but with clarity, how variance was engineered, how chain of custody had been preserved, how interpretive discretion had been weaponized into fraud. He spoke of the children waiting for surgeries delayed because of reputational sabotage, children whose hearts beat like small clocks running out of time. "This isn't about me," Mason said evenly. "It's about them. Every falsified test meant another headline, another delay, another child put at risk. I don't care what name you clear. I care that you clear the path for them." For a moment, the chamber was utterly still. A juror, an older man with carpenter's hands, tapped his knuckles once on the table as if in assent. Linda concluded briskly, "This affidavit will hold in court. We will proceed." When Mason stepped back into the waiting room, Ava leapt up, eyes wide. "What did they say?" He crouched, his hand still warm from holding the affidavit. "They said the truth is strong enough to stand. And now it will walk into the light." The marble steps of the New York County Courthouse had never seemed so crowded. News vans lined Center Street, satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical sunflowers, cameras humming, microphones thrust forward with the hunger of wolves. Headlines had already framed Mason Whitfield as the fallen titan, the disgraced CEO clinging to scraps of credibility. But this morning, the courthouse itself became theater, and the affidavit, sealed in red, bound with a blue ribbon, would be its script. Inside, the great rotunda reverberated with footsteps and whispers. Ava sat close to Mason, her hand resting protectively on the envelope he carried. She wore her gray cardigan, her hair tied back, her gaze fixed ahead with a gravity that made even seasoned reporters lower their voices when they noticed her. "Are you ready?" Mason's attorney, Sarah Mitchell, asked. She was brisk, her navy suit perfectly pressed, her binder full of motions. But her eyes softened when they met Ava's. "We're not here to win headlines," Mason replied quietly. "We're here to win the truth." They entered the courtroom. Rows of wooden benches sagged under the weight of journalists, families, interns, and spectators who had queued since dawn. The judge, stern and silver-haired, presided at the bench with a gavel that promised no indulgence. The bailiff called the case, Whitfield v. Ellison. The trial had begun. Sarah rose first, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She walked to the lectern, lifted the affidavit, and let the jury see the seal, the ribbon, the words stamped in black ink. Affidavit. Confidential. "This," she said, her voice resonant, "is not rumor. It is not spin. It is a sworn statement, signed under penalty of perjury and corroborated by documents no one thought you would see. Today, ladies and gentlemen, you will hear how truth was not only buried, but sold." She opened the envelope, each movement deliberate, and began reading. Her tone carried not theatrics but the steady rhythm of fact, word by word, like a hammer laying nails. "I, Gilbert Shue, clinical genetics technician, do hereby swear—" Each line built a scaffold. Dates, orders, instructions to falsify baselines, threats of termination, financial inducements. The jury's faces shifted. Shock, anger, the slow dawning of betrayal. The defense attorney, a sleek man in a charcoal suit, objected almost reflexively. "Your Honor, this is hearsay until we—" The judge cut him off. "It's sworn testimony, admitted under affidavit. Overruled." Sarah continued, turning to the attachments. She projected the email chains onto a screen. Large, undeniable. "Variance outside acceptable range. Apply corrected baseline. Legal is aligned on phrasing. Use consistent with. We can survive the science. What we cannot survive is doubt." The words floated across the courtroom, damning in their simplicity. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A reporter scribbled furiously, another whispered into a microphone that streamed live updates to a restless city. At the plaintiff's bench, Mason sat still, hands clasped, his gaze steady on the jurors. Beside him, Ava leaned forward, her chin on her fists, listening as though the whole world balanced on each syllable. The defense fought back. They summoned their own witnesses, executives who spoke of interpretive discretion, analysts who insisted variance was industry standard. They dressed deceit in corporate polish. But under cross-examination, Sarah stripped their words bare. "With respect," she said to one vice president, "are you telling this jury that a child's life can be categorized as an artifact?" The man stammered. "No, that's not—" "Then why did your email instruct your staff to call it that?" The screen glowed again, displaying his words. His mouth opened, closed. Silence. The judge's gavel struck once. "Answer the question," his voice cracked. "Because we were told to." By mid-afternoon, the courtroom felt electric. The jury leaned forward, pens moving, brows furrowed. The press gallery vibrated with restless urgency. The affidavit was no longer an artifact. It had become a weapon, cutting through months of lies. Then Sarah paused. She closed the file, set it on the lectern, and lowered her voice to a near whisper. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client was not just attacked as a man. He was attacked as a steward of children who depend on this science to live. Every day of delay caused by fabricated doubt risked another heartbeat. We do not bring you theater. We bring you receipts." Her eyes found Ava, sitting in the front row. "And we bring you witnesses who believe truth should not be hidden in envelopes." A hush fell over the room. Ava, small but steady, whispered just loud enough for those near her to hear, "Read it all, so they can't lie anymore." The phrase traveled like a tremor, repeated in low voices across the benches. "Read it all. Read it all." The judge adjourned for the day, but the atmosphere was anything but finished. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed, questions flying like arrows. Mason stepped into the glare of spotlights, the affidavit clutched to his chest. He could have said many things, about his vindication, his enemies, his company's survival, but he chose only one. "This isn't about my name," he said firmly, his breath misting in the cold air. "It's about children's lives. And that is the only verdict that matters." The microphones crowded closer. Photographers shouted. Yet all Mason felt was Ava's hand slipping into his, grounding him in the storm. Together they walked down the courthouse steps, the red seal and the blue ribbon still visible against the night's falling shadow. And across New York, the words began to spread like wildfire. Read it all. The morning after the civil trial's first day, New York awoke to headlines that felt like a collective gasp. Newsstands across Manhattan displayed broadsheets in bold. CEO cleared, scandal engineered. Email trail exposed, children at risk. Whitfield affidavit shifts case. Even tabloids, notorious for reducing lives to sensational ink, had pivoted. The photos were unmistakable. Mason stepping down the courthouse stairs, Ava at his side, the affidavit clutched to his chest like a shield. For months he had been painted as a villain, a reckless executive who put profits over patients. Now, the narrative inverted overnight. The city smelled blood, but not his. At Whitfield Tower, the 30th floor hummed with calls from reporters, investors, even former critics desperate to recast themselves as allies. Mason sat at his desk, the blinds drawn, the affidavit and ribbon laid out beside him like relics. Ava perched on the corner of the sofa, her small hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa. The TV murmured in the background, tuned to a live segment. A journalist's voice rang clear. Yesterday's dramatic reading of a sworn affidavit has upended the trial narrative. Instead of a reckless CEO, jurors heard of altered baselines, suppressed results, and corporate spin directed by Sabrina Ellison. Sources close to the investigation confirm federal prosecutors are pursuing additional charges. The story is no longer Whitfield's reputation. It's the lives of children caught in the crossfire. The camera cut to a pediatric cardiologist from Mount Sinai. Each delay in testing meant another child's surgery postponed. You cannot measure the cost in dollars. You measure it in heartbeats lost. Ava turned to Mason. They're listening now. Mason nodded slowly. Truth leaves its own echo. By noon, the press demanded a statement. Advisors urged him to stay cautious, issue a bland release, avoid fueling the spectacle. But Mason had learned the cost of silence. He stood before the microphones in the Whitfield Tower lobby, cameras crowded against velvet ropes, the marble floor slick with reflections of flashbulbs. His suit was plain gray, no flourishes, his voice steady as stone. "I will not hide from you," he began. The crowd hushed. "But this is not about my name. Not anymore. This is about children whose futures were gambled away in emails and boardrooms." He held up the affidavit. "This isn't theater. These are sworn words, receipts of truth. Every manipulated result meant another delay, another life in jeopardy. We cannot allow that to stand. Not in this city, not in this country." A reporter shouted, "Mr. Whitfield, what about your personal reputation? Your company's future?" Mason met the gaze head-on. "My reputation is irrelevant compared to a child's heart that needs repair. This isn't about profit, it's about life. And if you're looking for a story, let it be this. We are expanding the fund. No child should wait because adults chose lies over truth." Flashbulbs ignited like lightning. The statement ran live on 3 networks. By evening, clips circulated globally, the CEO who turned the story away from himself. Meanwhile, Sabrina's camp scrambled. Leaked audio surfaced, a voicemail in which she urged a consultant to bury variants under patient privacy. It played on late-night news, the host's expression grim. Public opinion shifted with ferocity. Commentators who once dissected Mason's downfall now praised his candor. Hashtags trended. #RateItAll. #Proof with receipts. #Hearts first. At a diner in Queens, a waitress slid a free slice of pie onto Ava's plate. "For you, sweetheart," she said softly, "because you reminded us not to give up." Ava's eyes widened, then she smiled, the kind of smile that could bend even a newsroom's cynicism. In the courthouse hallway on day 2, Mason overheard a reporter whisper, "He looks different now, doesn't he? Less like a CEO, more like, I don't know, a guardian." Another replied, "Yeah, and the girl, what's her name? Ava? She's the heart of this story. The way she said, 'Read it all,' my newsroom replayed that clip 10 times." That night, Mason sat on the rooftop garden of Whitfield Tower, the city glittering below. Ava leaned against him, drawing with crayons on a pad balanced across her knees. She had sketched a giant heart, ribboned blue, with the words, "Truth with receipts. Love with receipts." He smiled faintly. "That phrase will follow us, you know." Ava shrugged, pragmatic. "It should." Back in Brooklyn, a mother named Carla Torres watched Mason's press conference on a flickering TV. Her daughter, Sophia, 6 years old, sat beside her with a chest scar from surgery delayed nearly a year. Carla whispered through tears, "Maybe now, more kids like you will get their chance." Sophia nodded and pointed at the screen. That's the man with Ava, right? He's telling the truth now. The following morning, newspapers across the country echoed the shift. Not a fallen CEO, a father figure for the forgotten. From scandal to stewardship, Whitfield's fight for children's hearts. In every image, Mason and Ava walked together, the affidavit ribbon flashing like a thread of justice binding past and future. The tide had turned. The press room at Whitfield Labs had been transformed overnight. Rows of chairs filled the atrium, spotlights hung from steel rigs, and a podium draped in deep blue fabric stood beneath the company's seal. Yet the space no longer felt like the lair of a corporation fighting for survival. It felt like a chapel of sorts, a place where truth might be spoken not as defense, but as promise. Cameras lined the back wall, lenses waiting to turn words into headlines. Across the stage, a giant banner stretched in bold letters, Atoria Children's Mitral Fund, Phase 2. Announcement. Ava sat in the front row, legs swinging, the blue ribbon coiled in her lap like a secret talisman. The room buzzed with the chatter of reporters, but she seemed calm, watching Mason prepare himself in the wings, straightening his tie, not to impress, but to steady his breathing. He approached the podium, and the hum fell away. Not long ago, Mason began, voice low but resonant, this building was the center of a storm. Lies were crafted in its corridors. Data was bent. Children's futures were gambled like poker chips. The reporters stiffened. Pens flew. And then a truth appeared where no one expected it, hidden in a library book, carried by a child who believed what so many had forgotten, that truth leaves receipts. That's why we're here. Not for me, for them. He lifted a hand toward the banner. The Atoria Children's Mitral Fund, born in the ashes of scandal, is no longer an experiment. Today, we expand. He paused, letting the cameras lean in. Phase 1 gave life-saving heart surgery to 10 children in New York. Phase 2 will extend that gift to as many as 50 children, here and across this nation. Every procedure fully funded, every cost covered. No parent should sign a check when all they want is to hold their child's hand through recovery. The room erupted, shutters clicking, whispers turning to gasps. A journalist from the Times stood. Mr. Whitfield, are you saying this expansion is immediate? Mason nodded. Immediate. Approvals are in place. Hospitals are on standby. The first files are already being reviewed. Another reporter raised a hand. What about the board? Your investors? Surely such a scale. Mason cut gently across. The board has already voted unanimously. After what we've endured, they understand that legacy outweighs quarterly reports. And if they did not, I would have walked away. Because there is no business model worth more than a child's heartbeat. He stepped aside briefly. A doctor from Columbia Presbyterian took the podium, detailing how the fund would cover mitral valve repair surgeries, post-operative care, even long-term medication. She spoke in clinical terms, percentages of survival rates, improvements in ejection fraction, but her eyes watered as she described the first 10 children, all thriving today because the fund had bridged the gap between need and means. Then Mason returned, gesturing gently toward Ava. This fund carries her fingerprints as much as mine. She reminded me that truth is more than defense. It's a seed, and every seed deserves to be planted in fertile ground. Ava stood shyly, clutching the ribbon. The microphones hissed, waiting. She stepped forward just far enough that her voice carried. This is proof of the heart. Always. The audience stilled. Some reporters lowered their pens. Others simply blinked, as though they had forgotten that justice could sound this small, this simple, and still ring louder than boardroom jargon. Mason placed a hand on her shoulder, steady. You heard her. This is the proof that matters. The press conference ended with applause, rare in a room of journalists trained to observe, not cheer, yet it spread like a wave, echoing off the atrium walls. Later that evening, Mason and Ava stood in his office overlooking the city. The skyline glowed, bridges stretching like arteries across the river. On his desk lay stacks of fresh applications, letters from hospitals across the state, each folder carrying the name of a child in need. Ava traced the spines with her finger. "These are all kids waiting?" "Yes," Mason said softly, "but not for long." He lifted the top folder. Inside was a photograph of a boy from Newark, 8 years old, with eyes too old for his years and a smile tentative but fierce. His case was stamped urgent. Mason closed the folder gently as though promising it an answer. "This is the legacy we're building," he said. "Not just a fund, not just surgeries. A promise that the truth doesn't end in court. It walks out of those walls and changes lives." Ava leaned against him. "Truth with receipts," she murmured. He kissed the top of her hair. "Love with receipts." Outside, the city pulsed with light. Inside, a movement had begun. No longer just defense, but offense. No longer survival, but seed planting. The fund had expanded, and with it, the definition of what one man, one child, and one affidavit could build together. The train to Newark rattled across the Hudson beneath a pale December sky. Ava pressed her forehead to the window, watching the skyline of Manhattan slip behind them. For weeks, she had heard Mason talk about Phase 2, but now the idea was no longer an announcement. It was a boy's name on a chart, a hospital wing waiting, a chance carried across the river. Mason sat opposite her, a leather folder on his lap. He looked at it often, but not with the nervousness of a CEO preparing to speak. It was something deeper, gentler, like a father carrying photographs of his children. "Who is he?" Ava asked, nodding toward the folder. "Luis Santiago," Mason replied softly. 8 years old. He lives here in Newark with his mother, Elena. He's been waiting almost a year for a mitral valve repair." Ava chewed her lip. "Like the kids in New York?" "Exactly like them," Mason said. "Except this time, we didn't wait." The train slowed into Newark Penn Station. The streets outside were patched with snow, neon bodegas glowing against the cold. Mason and Ava walked quickly through the station, past commuters wrapped in scarves, until the looming glass of University Hospital Newark appeared ahead. Inside, the fund's banner had already been hung at the entrance. Atoria Children's Mitral Fund, expanding beyond New York. Doctors, nurses, and administrators gathered in the lobby, some carrying clipboards, others simply smiling at the sight of something that felt like relief. Dr. Priya Nandakumar, the pediatric cardiologist leading the procedure, shook Mason's hand firmly. "He's prepped, stable, and ready," she said. "But I'll be honest, without this fund, we wouldn't have dared schedule it. The family couldn't cover it. Insurance wouldn't touch it. You changed that." Mason's eyes softened. "We didn't," he said, glancing at Ava. "She did." The operating wing smelled of antiseptic and humming machinery. Through the glass, Ava glimpsed Luis, thin, pale, with dark eyes that carried both fear and defiance. He clutched a stuffed dog with one ear missing, whispering to it as though it might steady his heart before the surgeons did. Elena Santiago, his mother, stood beside him, exhaustion etched into her face. She turned as Mason and Ava entered, her voice trembling. "You came. After everything, you really came." Mason shook her hand. "We promised this fund wasn't about geography. It's about children." Ava stepped forward, small and steady. She slipped her fingers into Luis's hand. "Don't be scared," she said. "I was scared too. But then someone told me the truth always leaves a receipt. And this..." She gestured to the machines, the doctors waiting. "This is your receipt." Luis managed a weak smile. He squeezed her hand. "Will it hurt?" "Yes," Ava admitted, honest as always. "But then it won't anymore." Elena's eyes flooded. She kissed her son's forehead and whispered something in Spanish Mason didn't catch, but the meaning was clear, a prayer stitched into syllables. Hours later, Mason and Ava sat with Elena in the waiting room, the walls lined with outdated magazines and anxious families. Time slowed, measured only by the distant rhythm of heart monitors and the occasional soft step of a nurse. When Dr. Nandakumar finally appeared, removing her mask, her eyes told the story before her words. "It went beautifully. Valve repaired, rhythm stabilized. He'll need recovery, of course, but your boy has a chance now." Elena covered her mouth with both hands, sobbing. She turned and collapsed into Mason's arms, gratitude shaking her frame. "You didn't just save my son," she whispered. "You saved me." Mason held her gently, humbled by the rawness of her relief. He glanced at Ava, who sat still, wide-eyed, absorbing the weight of what she had just witnessed. The next morning, Luis sat propped in bed, color already blooming back into his cheeks. His stuffed dog rested beside him, a small hospital bracelet looped around its paw. Ava sat at his bedside, showing him how to draw hearts on the corner of the whiteboard. She drew one large heart, then tied a blue ribbon across it with a marker. "This is what we do now," she said simply. "We tie ribbons on proof." Luis laughed, weak but real. "Then you have to put one on my dog, too." Ava solemnly took the marker and drew a ribbon on the stuffed ear. Mason stood at the doorway, watching the scene. It struck him then that the fund was no longer paperwork or pledges. It was this: two children leaning close, one recovering from the knife, the other stitching courage into his day. He whispered to himself, as though carving the words into memory. This fund isn't a project, it's a legacy. Later that week, the Newark Ledger ran a front-page story. First heart saved in Newark. Whitfield Fund expands beyond New York. The photo captured Luis holding Ava's hand, his stuffed dog between them, a crude blue ribbon drawn across its head. The article quoted Mason. "No child should wait for surgery because adults chose lies. The fund belongs wherever children's hearts beat." In kitchens across New Jersey, families clipped the story, tacking it onto refrigerators. For them, it was more than a headline. It was a receipt. The conservatory garden in Central Park was a place where the city seemed to breathe differently. Iron gates opened into a world of trimmed hedges, fountains whispering in the dark, and lamps glowing like golden halos over gravel paths. On this winter evening, the 6-acre garden had been transformed into something else entirely, a gala hall beneath the stars. Strings of fairy lights wound through bare branches, casting a warm glow against the cold night air. Musicians tuned violins in the background, the sound mingling with laughter and the clink of glasses. Guests arrived in long coats and gowns, donors and doctors, families and children whose lives were marked by scars now healing. Mason stood at the edge of the central lawn, watching as Ava darted from one group to another, showing her drawing of the giant heart wrapped in a blue ribbon. Each guest smiled, some kneeling to listen, others taking photos. It was her gala as much as his. Sarah Mitchell, his attorney-turned-confidant, adjusted her shawl and whispered, "You've managed to do the impossible. They're not here for prestige, Mason. They're here for hope." He glanced around. Tables were filled not only with philanthropists, but also with families of children already saved by the fund. Doctors in white coats mingled with waiters carrying trays of cider and champagne. For once, the usual line between those who gave and those who received had dissolved. "Hope," Mason repeated softly. That's the only currency that matters tonight. The program began with the soft strains of a cello. Guests gathered near the stage, erected beneath the wisteria pergola, its columns wrapped in twinkling lights. Mason stepped up to the microphone. He paused, taking in the sight. A crowd of faces turned upward, waiting. "Tonight," he began, "we stand not in a courtroom but in a garden, and gardens are where seeds become something more. Months ago, I held an affidavit, paper that carried proof of betrayal. But tonight, I hold something greater, proof of the heart. Look around you. Every child here, every scar that's healing, every parent holding their son or daughter, that is the receipt of truth." The crowd hushed. Even the youngest children seemed to listen. "This fund is not mine alone. It belongs to Ava, who carried the ribbon into every room where I doubted. It belongs to Gilbert, who risked his career to sign the affidavit. It belongs to every doctor who refused to bend science to lies. And it belongs to you, because you chose to believe that a heart is worth more than a headline." He raised a hand toward the families seated in the front rows. "Tonight, we do not ask you to invest in a company. We ask you to invest in life. With your help, Phase 2 of the fund is just the beginning. We envision Phase 3, a national network, ensuring no child anywhere in America is left waiting for surgery because adults chose profit over compassion." Applause rippled, soft at first, then growing. Some wiped their eyes. The stage lights dimmed and a projection flickered onto a screen, a montage of letters and drawings sent by children saved through the fund. Crayon hearts, shaky handwriting, words that broke through even the most guarded souls. "Thank you for fixing my chest. Now I can play soccer again. You saved my mommy from crying every night." Gasps, sniffles, quiet murmurs filled the garden. Ava stepped onto the stage then, holding a folded paper nearly as tall as herself. She opened it to reveal her drawing of the giant heart with a blue ribbon tied across it. She lifted it high, her small voice carrying into the cold night. "This is for all the kids who are still waiting. Proof of the heart. Always." The guests stood. Some clapped. Others simply placed their hands over their own hearts. Later, under the canopy of lights, families took turns telling their stories. A father described how his son, once too weak to climb stairs, now raced ahead of him in the park. A mother from Newark, Elena Santiago, spoke of Luis's surgery just days earlier. Her voice cracked, but her words rang with pride. "You gave him more than a heart that beats. You gave us time, and time is everything." The audience wept openly. Donations flowed like a tide, not coerced but offered with trembling hands. By the end of the night, the pledge board behind the stage glowed with numbers that exceeded anything Mason had dared hope for. When the gala quieted, Mason wandered through the garden paths. Frost laced the edges of dormant roses, and the lamps threw his shadow long. Ava walked beside him, tired but glowing, her mittened hand in his. "Do you think we raised enough?" she asked. "We raised something better than money," Mason said. "We raised a promise." They stopped before the fountain, water shimmering in the lamplight. Mason crouched so their eyes met. "You know, Ava," he said, "gardens only grow if you tend them. Tonight we planted something that won't stop. This fund, this legacy, it's your garden too." Ava leaned against him, her breath fogging in the cold. "Then we have to take care of it. Always." Mason smiled, eyes burning with a mixture of pride and humility. "Always." The last image of the evening would make the front page the next morning. Mason and Ava on stage, her drawing of the giant ribboned heart taped behind them, golden light spilling over their shoulders as if the garden itself had bent to witness. The caption would read, "Tonight, we raise hope." Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Mason's office, painting the walnut desk in pale gold. Outside, the city churned, horns, footsteps, the endless pulse of New York. But inside, the world had slowed to paper and ink. A stack of envelopes sat in the center of the desk, their edges smoothed by careful hands. Some were marked with hospital logos, others decorated with crayon drawings of hearts, rainbows, or stick figures holding balloons. They had arrived after the Conservatory Garden Gala, delivered in bundles tied with twine, dropped at the front desk by couriers who seemed humbled to carry them. Ava sat cross-legged on the carpet, her backpack beside her, a pair of scissors and a blue ribbon within reach. She untied the first bundle, eyes wide. "Can I read one out loud?" Mason nodded. "They're yours as much as mine." The first letter was written in careful cursive, the paper thin and creased. Ava read slowly, sounding out words with gravity. "Dear Mr. Whitfield, my daughter Mia received her surgery last spring. For the first time in years, she can run without stopping to catch her breath. I watched her chase fireflies in our backyard last week, and I realized something. I wasn't crying because I was afraid anymore. I was crying because she was free. Thank you for giving us back nights that are just ordinary. Ordinary is the most extraordinary gift." Ava looked up, her eyes shining. "Ordinary," she whispered. "That's the gift." Mason felt his throat tighten. He placed the letter gently on the growing pile of receipts. The second envelope was brightly colored, decorated with stickers of stars and dinosaurs. Ava tore it open eagerly. A child's handwriting sprawled across the page in uneven lines. "Thank you for fixing my chest. Now I can play soccer with my friends. My team won because I kicked the ball really hard. My mom said, 'You are like a coach for hearts.' From Jamal, age 9. A sketch of a stick figure with a giant soccer ball filled the bottom of the page. Ava giggled softly. "A coach for hearts," she said. "That's what you are." Mason smiled, though his eyes were damp. "Then I'll take the job for life." Letter after letter was opened. Some were short, just a line scribbled by a parent who didn't know how to put gratitude into words. Others stretched pages, telling stories of months in hospital corridors, of siblings waiting in plastic chairs, of nights parents thought they wouldn't see their child live until morning. One came from a mother in Newark, Elena Santiago, Luis's mother. "You gave my son another heartbeat, but you gave me something too. For the first time, I dared to plan for tomorrow. Thank you for not seeing us as charity but as family." Mason folded the letter slowly, pressing it to his chest. Ava, watching, whispered, "She's right. It's family." Among the stack was a thick envelope filled not with words but drawings. Crayons had been pushed hard into paper, red hearts, blue ribbons, shaky stick figures with wide smiles. One drawing showed a child in a hospital bed, another child standing beside them holding a balloon. Across the top, in block letters, "Thank you for fixing hearts." Ava laid the drawing flat on the desk. "We should put these on the wall," she declared. "All of them. Like proof." Mason laughed quietly, but he nodded. Receipts of love. Then came the letter that stilled the room. It was handwritten on stationery edged with faded roses. Mason unfolded it carefully. The script was elegant but uneven, as though written by a hand trembling between strength and exhaustion. "To Mr. Whitfield and to Ava, you don't know me. My son Daniel was not chosen for Phase 1. He passed away in May, before Phase 2 began. I thought I would only feel bitterness, but last week I watched your gala online, and I saw Ava lift a drawing of a heart wrapped in blue ribbon. I wept, not in anger, but in relief, because I knew other mothers would not have to bury their children as I did. You didn't save my son's heart, but you saved mine, because you reminded me that love can be larger than grief. Carry this fund forward. Carry it for all of us who lost." Ava was silent, her small fingers gripping the ribbon in her lap. Tears slid down her cheeks. "She said we saved her heart," she whispered. Mason's voice broke. "Yes, Ava. Even when we can't save every child, we can still save love." He folded the letter as though it were glass, placed it gently on top of the stack. By evening, the desk was covered in letters, each one a fragment of lives touched by truth carried forward. Ava insisted on tying them together with the blue ribbon, wrapping it tight until the bundle looked almost ceremonial. She stood on tiptoe to place it on Mason's bookshelf beside the affidavit, the diary, the consent form, the trilogy of paper that had carried them here. "This," she said firmly, "is the proof that matters." Mason looked at her, at the bundle of letters glowing in the lamplight, and he understood that legacies weren't measured in boardrooms or verdicts. They were measured in kitchen tables where children laughed again, in backyards where fireflies were chased, in mothers who dared to plan for tomorrow. He reached down, lifted Ava into his arms, and whispered into her hair, "Truth with receipts. Love with receipts." Outside the window, the city kept moving, unaware of the small ceremony in the corner office. But within that room, under the watchful quiet of letters tied with ribbon, a legacy had already begun to grow roots. The conservatory garden had changed. Months ago, its arches had glowed gold in winter's night for the gala. Tonight it was different. Spring had come. Morning light spilled over new leaves, daffodils swayed along the stone paths, and the fountain shimmered in the sunlight like glass come alive. The air carried not the hush of anticipation, but the gentleness of renewal. Guests filled a small circle of white chairs. There were no cameras, no journalists, just family, doctors, children whose laughter echoed across the hedges, and the parents who had once waited in hospital corridors counting heartbeats. Ava, her dress simple but brightened with a soft blue sash, walked slowly down the aisle between rows of blooming tulips. In her hands she carried not flowers but a bundle tied with a blue ribbon, the diary, the affidavit, and the letters of thanks, bound together now as if they had always belonged. Mason stood beneath the pergola, dressed plainly, no longer the figure of a CEO, but of a man who had fought through storms to arrive at stillness. Rachel waited beside him, her bouquet a mix of white roses and lilacs, her eyes bright, steady, unafraid. When Ava reached them, she set the bundle carefully on the small wooden table between Mason and Rachel. Her voice carried in the clear air, not just proof of truth. Today, proof of love. The words rippled through the garden like wind across water. Mason reached down, his hand covering the ribboned bundle, and the guests exhaled softly. The officiant smiled, beginning the vows. Mason turned to Rachel. "I once thought my story would end in boardrooms and battles, but you showed me it could begin again, here, in gardens, in laughter, in family. I vow not only to love you, but to live that love as evidence, so that Ava and every child touched by our journey will know. This is what love builds." Rachel took his hands. "I saw you when your name was in ruins. I saw you rise not by pride, but by kindness, by truth. I vow to carry that truth with you, to raise Ava with you, and to plant gardens of hope that will bloom long after we are gone." Ava tugged at their joined hands, smiling. "And I'll remind you both every day what matters." Laughter stirred through tears among the guests. The officiant raised his voice gently. by the power vested in me and in the witness of every heart saved along this journey, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Applause rose, not thunderous but tender, lingering. Mason kissed Rachel, not as a man claiming victory, but as one finally finding home. Ava threw her arms around them both, the three bound together in sunlight and promise. After the ceremony, families gathered near the fountain. Children with fading scars chased bubbles that floated in the breeze. Doctors who once signed grim charts now signed guest books with joy. Parents who had once prayed for minutes of survival now celebrated hours, days, years reclaimed. Elena Santiago approached with Luis, his cheeks round with recovery. She held Mason's hand tightly. "You didn't just give us another heartbeat. You gave us this morning." Mason shook his head gently. "You gave it to us, by believing when it was hardest." As the garden slowly emptied, Mason, Rachel, and Ava remained by the fountain. The bundle of papers lay between them, ribbon fluttering. Mason touched it lightly, his voice almost a whisper. "This is our circle. From diary to affidavit, from court to garden. Not only truth with receipts, but love with receipts." Rachel kissed Ava's temple. "This is our family." Ava nodded firmly, her eyes reflecting the morning sky. "Then let's keep planting gardens." And in that moment, beneath spring light and lilac bloom, the circle closed, not with endings, but with beginnings. 5 years later, the fund had reached hospitals across the country. Hundreds of children were running, laughing, living with whole hearts again. On Mason's bookshelf, the diary, the affidavit, and the letters still sat, bound in the same blue ribbon, faded but unbroken. Ava, taller now, often said to visitors, "These are our receipts, proof of truth, proof of love." And in every garden, every hospital wing, every family dinner table where a child's laughter returned, that proof kept growing. If stories of truth, love, and second chances touch your heart, please subscribe and stay with us. Together, we'll keep planting gardens of hope.